Criminal charges are expected to be brought by Brazilian prosecutors against executives of two U.S. companies, Chevron and Transocean, following a relatively small oil spill. We ask if harsh penalties might slow the rush to develop Brazil's vast offshore oil wealth. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. The discovery of vast reserves of pre-salt oil off the coast of Brazil, some 50 billion barrels of the stuff, is supposed to create a boom for the nation. Western oil companies, together with their vast cash stockpiles and superior technology, rushed in to take their slice of the pie. But now the Brazilian authorities are pitting themselves against two U.S. oil companies, Chevron and Transocean, following a relatively small oil spill last November at the Frade field, some 360 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro's coast. The accident cracked geological structures in the reservoir, and oil will continue leaking from the field until it's emptied. But so far, it's only leaked up to 3,000 barrels of oil. That's a small leak compared to many others. Just last week, the same well started seeping oil once again, and Chevron has temporarily suspended production. 17 managers from the two companies have had their passports revoked, and they're likely to face criminal charges. Prosecutors will allege that the companies should not have drilled the deepwater well that leaked and that they knew of the risks. Gabriel Elizondo is following the case from Sao Paulo.
Some people might be wondering if the Brazilian government isn't applying a double standard in the way that they treat Chevron as compared to Petrobras, the state-run oil company. And the people that believe this correctly point to the fact that Petrobras had over 36 oil spills in 2011 alone, and no criminal charges were brought against that company. But the case with Chevron is different, people here in Brazil say, for two reasons. One is, with Chevron, it's an issue of transparency. Investigators say that Chevron was less than forthcoming with information in the early stages of this oil spill investigation, but also negligence. Investigators are looking at the fact that Chevron was negligent in the way that they were operating that well that directly led to this oil spill. Now, Chevron denies all of that. But the bigger picture here is the huge amounts of untapped oil reserves off Brazil's coastline. The low estimates say there could be 50 billion barrels of oil. The high estimates say there could be 150 billion barrels. And the whole discussion and the discourse here in Brazil the last few years since this oil was discovered has centered around the economic benefits. There's been very little discussion about the environmental risks that go along with such risky deepwater oil exploration, but that is now all starting to change with this Chevron spill. People are now here in Brazil starting to look in the mirror and ask themselves, what would happen here? Are we prepared here in Brazil to deal with a catastrophic oil spill like what you saw in the Gulf of Mexico with the BP situation? Is Brazil prepared to deal with such a situation here? That is a question now that is starting to be raised since this Chevron incident. There's lots of questions, but very few answers if Brazil would be ready for such an incident.
So, will harsh penalties against Chevron discourage it and other oil companies from drilling off the coast of Brazil? And is there such a thing as too much regulation? To answer these questions and more, we're joined in the studio by Thomas Pyle. He's the president of the Institute for Energy Research. From Rio de Janeiro, we're joined by Marcelo Lins, a journalist with Globo News television in Brazil and the producer of a film in which he predicted the Chevron oil spill before it happened. And also in the studio is Diane MacEachern, an author on environmental issues who also worked as a consultant for the Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome to all of you to the show.
Thank you.
Marcelo Lins, let me start with you. What is the latest on this case against Chevron and Transocean, and what kind of charges are they facing?
Hello, and first of all, thank you for having me on the show. The latest on this case is that the investigations are still going on, but the preliminary findings point to the fact that apparently Chevron wasn't careful enough in the drilling in a specific part of the Campos oil field called Frade. And apparently they used too much pressure in this drilling, and that may be the cause of the first spill that we had 4 months ago. And these facts come from an investigation from the federal police here in Brazil. And that's why some Chevron executives and employees have been forbidden to leave the country. And their lawyers are trying to manage to deal with this situation, but this is the case right now. I think that in the near future we must expect some negotiation, and I don't think that that we're looking for prison mandate or anything like that here. We should be seeing, moreover, some huge fines to sending some sort of sign of alert for Chevron and other companies that are coming to Brazil or are already in Brazil,
right,
to exploit oil here. That's what we're looking for in the next future. And I think what I say that is a sign of alert they are sending is that Brazil is right now in a sort of a delicate position, because in June we are hosting the Rio +20 United Nations Convention on Sustainable Development. And it's very important that Brazil takes some stance in these important matters.
Okay. All right. Diane, given what's at stake here, these vast oil reserves that Brazil is depending on, is Brazil shooting itself in the foot here, as one analyst put it? Because there's already something of a ripple effect. We know that there's a company, an oil company in Houston here in the United States called Anadarko Petroleum, which is also already now considering selling its holdings in Brazil, 700,000 acres. So is it doing more damage than good?
Well, the question is really, what is the long-term picture for oil and oil development, not only in Brazil, but around the world? And we've just seen a string of oil spills. And in fact, in preparation for the show, I went back and looked at the history of oil spills since 1967. We're just constantly putting millions of gallons of oil into the ocean. And the ocean is not a sewer. It supports 99% of the life on Earth. So the question is really, I think, not just for Brazil, but just the entire world community needs to come to grips with the impact of oil drilling on the environment.
Okay, Thomas, before I get to you, let's take a look at how much oil Brazil is actually sitting on. The government says there's 50 billion barrels underneath the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, which could last the next 50 years. It's known as pre-salt reserves. That makes Brazil the country with the third biggest reserves in the world. The Frade oil field in the Campos Basin is 370 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro. It has an estimated 300 million barrels of oil. The spill caused an oil slick nearly 4 kilometers long. Chevron has temporarily suspended oil production on that Frade field. So the question is, what kind of an effect is this going to have on Brazil's oil industry? I mean, Chevron's investing pretty heavily, $2.5 billion to date.
Yeah, well, the Brazilian people really need to answer that question for themselves, and that is, where do we want to fuel the next period of growth in our nation? They're already, I believe, the 6th largest economy in the world, and they do have the resource, and there's a lot of interest in developing the resource both from the Brazilian side and from the perspective of companies. My feeling about it is that if Brazil overplays its hand with respect to the regulations, and more importantly, they're inconsistent with those regulations, they will send a bit of a chilling effect out to the industry, and we'll begin to see more situations like Anadarko. So if I were to be developing those fields, I would want companies like Chevron and the other companies involved, because they have the most experience with these deep water wells, and they do a good job. And in spite of incidents, nobody wants to see any oil spilled, but of course it's not going to be something that can never happen. So they really do have to strike that right balance between incentivizing these companies and sending the right message in terms of just how far they want to go with respect to regulation.
Right, Marcelo, is that a danger that Brazil faces, that it could discourage investment by other companies in the country if it takes this kind of action against Chevron and Transocean?
Some analysts tend to follow this line of thought, but I don't think that there is any crazy mind in Brasilia or in Petrobras or in the National Oil Agency, the ANP, here in Brazil, thinking that we won't touch this oil. We're talking here about a huge volume. You said 50 billion barrels, something like that. The numbers are very, very high. And I think that it's obvious that we're gonna have to exploit this oil even to make this money worth. But we know also that exploiting oil involves risks. And I think that what we have the chance to try and do right now is to minimize these risks. And I think that sending a clear message with high fines or with a fund to clean eventual other spills and everything can send the right message. Of course, we want to have the partnership of foreign companies, and the country have lots of contracts signed already with American and British and lots of different companies all over the world. And we have the technology to do the drillings and everything. But the risks are there. They are, this is an industry that works with the risk itself. So we can't just forget and think that we have only to drill and to take the soil. No, we have to do anything is in our hands to minimize the risk. The big problem here, in my mind, is that as in a lot of areas, Brazilian state is inefficient, and the regulatory agency that we have to overlook all the exploration, the huge coastline of Brazil, is small, doesn't have the means to do it, depends on the information given by the oil companies themselves. And so we don't have much room to maneuver in a way that we can be more efficient. I think that there's a big task here for the NGOs and for the society and for the press and everything, which is put pressure in the government to be more efficient in its work of supervising this industry. And then we can have, I think, that's a proper relationship with the companies.
But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, I mean, what the measures that are being taken for this particular incident, if they're commensurate with the incident. We're talking about threatening criminal sanctions against the employees. We're talking about a massive fine for a relatively small spill. So it is sending a message that if you're not Petrobras, or if you're not a state-owned oil company and you do business in Brazil, you may run the risk of this inconsistent sort of hammering effect.
But I would say, you know, at this point, we continue to see these devastating oil spills. I mean, 3,000 gallons or 3,000 barrels may be insignificant to this particular spill, but in the aggregate, I think we need to stop looking at spills as individual incidents. They are all part of a whole. And until the entire industry responds, I think the threat of these fines and these criminal proceedings, you know, they should send a chill into the industry, because the industry needs to do a much better job. From all indications, Chevron knew that this particular well, that it was under very high pressure, and it sounds like going into this process, there was really the threat sort of understood that there could be an accident. And we have to really take action up front, and if they think they're going to have an $11 million or $1 billion fine, whatever it is, then perhaps they'll be more cautious at the front end.
We don't know all the details, and we'll learn them as the story unfolds.
One of the initial investigations did say that the company, Chevron, did not take the necessary safety precautions when it went to drill on this deepwater well.
Well, like I said, I don't have all the details there, but I will say this. The threat of the criminal sanctions and the other punitive measures that are taken are, to me, more of a disincentive, because oil companies don't have an incentive to spill oil. They cannot sell oil that they spill, one. Nobody, I don't believe anyone thinks that they actually seek to try and harm the environment. And so, to me, that in and of itself is an incentive. If we learned anything from the Macondo spill here in the United States, the overreaction by the government, in a lot of cases, pushed out the industry, froze the industry here temporarily, and sent rigs overseas. Those rigs are still operating in places that have less environmental restrictions, less stringent standards. The fact of the matter is we live in an economy, a global economy, where oil is the major source for transportation fuel. Right. And unless and until we get off of it, we're still going to need it as a world.
Okay, Marcelo?
I tend to agree that maybe they are being a bit too heavy in this specific case, but I'm sure as well that the country has to show that it's prepared to, if it has to put some very, very high fines for for oil spills, because it's only with this sort of pressure, I think, that the industry will put more money as well in the research of some safeguards of the whole prospecting industry and everything. It's more or less what happens in the car industry here in Brazil. We have some of the biggest companies of the world working here. We have Volkswagen, we have Fiat from Italy, we have Chevrolet, we have everything. And if you take the Brazilian legislation on safety in cars that are made here, it is something like 20 or 30 years behind what's going on in the States or in Europe. And it's the same company that produces car here and in Europe and in the States. And there they adopt much tougher regulations on safety for cars. And here you always listen that this will make the prices very high, that we can do this and can do that. But I don't think that it's the case. I think that now with the oil industry, Brazil is also learning how to put some limits on the work of the industry to make it safer for the environment and the whole country. But of course that this oil will be exploited and will be drilled, and we are going to explore these reserves. They are huge.
Diane, what is the ideal situation here? I mean, you heard Marcelo earlier on talk about the risks that are prevalent in drilling for oil. I mean, is it balancing those risks against the benefits for the country, or is it just shutting down the wells altogether?
Ultimately, I think that a lot of the wells do need to be shut down as we move towards more renewable resources and safer resources. We're just doing untold damage to the environment, not only to the immediate environment in the ocean, let's say, where these spills are occurring, but all the secondary impacts of burning oil. I mean, the Rio +20 is going to be happening, and a big conversation there is going to be about climate change that's related to the burning of oil. So yes, maybe this oil field has 50 years of life in it, and everybody sort of think that's very short term in the history of the world, certainly, but in terms of the nature of the problems that we need to deal with, 50 years isn't very long. You know, if 50 years ago, if we had started this transition away from fossil fuels, we would be today where we should be.
Well, we're never going to replace a barrel of oil with energy from a windmill. That's just wind makes electricity.
But it's got to happen at some point.
Oil is a transportation fuel.
And it's also a finite fuel.
The fact of the matter is that we've got huge, vast resources, as we're talking about in Brazil, here in the United States. So the question is how do you deal with the reality that we're an oil-based society and not be in a position in any 50 years, I would argue 100 years, to replace oil with wind or solar or some of these other alternatives. The market will sort that out, but in the interim, countries deserve the ability to grow. Countries deserve the ability to expand their middle class, and that's what you're seeing in these developing nations around the world. And I, for one, think it's a great thing.
Well, we certainly want developing nations, we want all nations to be able to raise their standard of living to the degree that they want to. But to do it on the back of a fuel that has been proven to cause so many problems continues to be, I think, very short-term thinking. And you know, there is a tremendous opportunity to reduce the amount of oil that we're using through conservation, and in fact electric vehicles, that's another opportunity. So I think that it's a question of attitude. Do we want to look at fossil fuels, and not just oil, but fossil fuels, and say, you know, we have really got to make a concerted effort to wean our way away from fossil fuels as soon as possible? Or do we continue to invest untold billions of dollars in a fuel that's going to contribute to climate change, air pollution, water pollution, and all of these other environmental problems that are very difficult to clean up?
Okay, I want to move on to another issue now. These are the oil leaks. Marcelo, I'll get to you in a moment. Brazil's state-owned oil company Petrobras owns 30% of the Frade oil well. The company has also reported hundreds of oil spills in other wells. In July 2000, a Petrobras pipeline broke, spilling nearly 24,000 barrels of oil that flowed downstream to the Iguacu Falls, a major tourist attraction, turning the nearby Barangui River black. In March 2000, a Petrobras oil platform exploded and sank to the ocean floor. It spilled up to 7,500 barrels of oil. Later that year, Petrobras shuts down nearly 10% of the country's oil production. And in 2010, Petrobras reported 57 oil leaks. The 4,000 barrels of oil that spill is over the company's legal limit for the year, and twice as much that spilled from the Frade leak. Let me go to Marcelo here. When we look at the number of leaks that Petrobras has been responsible for, is the government playing politics here by going after Chevron, the foreign company?
Maybe at some point. I wouldn't say 100%, but maybe at some point, yes. And the thing is that I think for the government it's much easier to go against Chevron than to go against Petrobras, its own company. And Petrobras is such a huge company in the country and knows so many things and works in so many different fields that it's really very difficult to get to them and to... we have a very good environmental laws, but the thing is they are very poorly applied, and Petrobras has very good lawyers, and they tend to delay the maximum, as much as they can, the period for them to pay these fines that they are receiving year after year. But I don't see another way of trying to make things better than to try and make the regulation more efficient. I think that the government must really work hard in efficiency together with maybe some NGOs and together with the industry to make its regulation more efficient. I don't think there is another way around this, because as we are saying here, we're not talking about 2 or 3 years, we're talking about some decades, we're talking about 50 years. We'll still be using fossil fuels. There's no way out of this. I don't see any government much eager to just abandon the cars in the garage or the buses or the trucks. We don't see this in the States, we don't see this in Europe, we don't see here in Latin America. And here people are having the chance for the first time to see the economy growing. I think that we have to do is to put this growth in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm just looking here at a comparison of the level of fines against BP and Chevron. BP could face an estimated $52 billion in fines for the 2010 oil spill. That was in the Gulf of Mexico, where an estimated 4.4 million barrels of oil gushed into the Gulf, yet that fine works out to just $12,000 per barrel. The Chevron spill in Brazil was tiny by comparison, just 3,000 barrels leaked into the ocean, yet Brazil is seeking damages of $3.6 million per barrel. Diana, something that Marcelo brought up over there, and that was how regulations are administered in Brazil. I mean, you know, Brazil, for instance, passed environmental laws 12 years ago. A lot of those laws have not been enforced. Is that the problem?
Well, it sounds like it is, and often the enforcement of regulations and laws that haven't passed is a problem. You know, there may not be enough money in a government's budget to do that. They may decide that they're going to look the other way for any number of reasons. They get political campaign contributions, or all kinds of things happen behind the scenes that we may not be aware of. But certainly, I don't think that's unique to Brazil. I think it happens in a lot of countries where strong regulations are passed, there are good intentions, and then they go unenforced. It's easier in many instances to pass a regulation than to enforce it. And so one of the things that it would be wonderful to see if Chevron ever does pay that fine is to put some of that money into an enforcement pool that can enforce the regulations that are on the books to strengthen the safety of the oil industry in Brazil.
Environmental regulations.
Yes, I think it's in the interest of the industry as well to make it safer. I don't think that it's only the interest of the environmental movement or of the press or anything.
Okay,
well,
Thomas,
I was just going to say environmental regulations and economic growth go hand in hand. I mean, we're one of the wealthiest nations in the world in the United States, and we have some of the best environmental record in the world as well. And so enforcement is one thing, and you went back and discussed whether there's an even hand being played here. And I think that's the most critical thing for Brazil, is whatever they decide with respect to fines and with respect to the process, they should apply it evenly across the board so that there's an element of certainty there, so that when a company decides that they want to work with Brazil and they want to work in that country, they know going in the rules aren't going to change on them halfway down. And that applies to any economic development and working with foreign investment.
Okay.
I think it's true, but also...
yeah? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to complete that. I think that this is true, but we can't forget that we are having access here, the press, but the NGOs even here in Brazil, we are having access to the preliminary investigation of this case. And even though those fines seem a bit harsh, we are in a democracy, and things are going according to the law. So
and they're barred from leaving the country.
We are going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time. That's it from the Inside Story team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. You can send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.